This is Research Like a Pro, episode 24, United States Probate Records, part 2. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the creators of the Amazon best-selling book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist's Guide. I'm Nicole, co-host of the podcast. Join Diana and me as we discuss how to stay organized, make progress in our research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go. Welcome to Research Like a Pro today. I'm Nicole.
And I'm Diana. Hello, everyone.
We're excited to share with you some case studies about probate records today. But first, we have a review from Debbie. Thank you for the great podcast. I have listened to every episode so far and some of them twice. They have been very helpful in understanding the principles outlined in the Research Like a Pro book and shared on the blog. I just listened to episode 10 today and it gave me some good ideas for my own research efforts to prove a relationship. Thanks for the review, Debbie. Glad that it's helping. Well, last week we talked about probate records and we reviewed all different kinds of wills and some of the language that you might see in them. And we gave a couple short examples. Well, today we wanted to give some longer examples, share a couple case studies with you that we've done in past research.
Yeah, it's really fun because you learn something from every single research project and every document. Every family's different, every case is different. So hopefully some of the things that we've learned can give you guys some ideas of things that you could pursue in your own research.
Right. And if you didn't get the cheat sheet that we made for you, this is a freebie about probate records that you can go download. The link will be in the show notes. The link is familylocket.lpages.co/probate. So go and get that freebie so that you can see on paper all of the things that we're talking about in this episode and the last episode. All right, so for our first case study, I'm going to ask Diana about the case of Thomas B. Royston. He is one of our great-great-great-grandfathers, and he was from Alabama. And Diana did a lot of research about him for her accreditation project. So Diana, tell us about how you found the probate file for Thomas B. Royston.
Well, the funny thing was when I first started researching, this was back before a lot of things were available online, and it was probably about 2004. And so I contacted the Chambers County Clerk's office where he had been living for probably 20 years and just asked them for any information on the Roystons. And he sent me this will. It was a photocopy of the will. It was like one of those big, long, extended sheets, and it went on for 2 or 3 pages. And I was really happy to find it because it mentioned my ancestor, Robert C. Royston, who was one of the 14 children of Thomas Beverly Royston. And it was what I needed to say, oh, yay, this is the correct connection. I was hoping it was, and when I got the will, I saw that. But I had no idea. I was too inexperienced at that time to realize that there was an entire probate packet of 48 pages that went on to actually talk about all of his children and where they had moved to. And it wasn't until I was working on accreditation, and this is my 3rd generation, and I really needed positive proof that I went digging, and I went to Ancestry, and I went to Alabama Wills and Probates, and there was the entire estate file. I was so excited. And so in the last episode, I talked about transcribing it. So I created the Google Doc, went through, transcribed every single image. And then because they were not in order, it was 48 pages and they were scrambled up. So I created an exact copy of that on another Google Doc. So I had my original of all the different images, and then on the copy of it, I put them in order by date. And that's where it really started making sense. So I basically created a little timeline of all the different images. You could do this with a table or whatever. I just needed to have everything in order. So what did I learn from that Thomas B. Royston case file? Well, his actually gave his death date that I talked about in a previous episode, which is super cool. And then he talks about, well, his wife, Cynthia, went in to start the probate proceedings. And in that document, she names a bunch of the children. She does not name all of the children because this is 1868. The Civil War has just come to an end, and 4 of her sons perished in the war. So they are not listed. Only the living children are listed. But having all the living children, like I said, they had 14 children. So actually, she names 11 living children, so 3 had died in the war. The really cool thing is that she names where they're living, and she gives the information about whether they're of full age or over 21 or minors under or over 14 years of age. So that obviously had to do with the law and how she had to detail out how old they were. So that was fun. But then a really fun thing was when I discovered the inventory of the estate, because this was a plantation, and they started off with all the livestock, and they listed the value of every single horse, cow, and hog, and then they went to all the tools, and then they did the household items. And they had 2 cotton gins that were worth $125, and blacksmith tools, and they had a sewing machine worth $25. So 1868 and a sewing machine. So this is obviously a pretty prosperous plantation. So that was pretty interesting. Thomas B. Royston was a slave owner, and if this had been prior to emancipation, there probably would have been a list of his slaves, so that I could have had the names of those and tried to help families become reconnected. But unfortunately, they had all been freed, and so there were no names of the enslaved people that had been on that plantation. So just something to kind of think about when you're looking at probate of that particular era, especially in the South. So as I was doing this transcription, I'm doing the 48 pages, I kept coming to these really interesting things. And so I found that about 6.5 years after that original inventory of 1868, it's now 1875. And one of the children, Joseph Royston, came into court, and he swears under oath that Cynthia, who was the wife and executrix, she's gone to Texas, and she hasn't made the final settlement. So what are they going to do now? She's gone. She's not coming back to Alabama. So they remove her from her duties, and then they set up a new administrator, a man named James M. Richards. And they say that $2,000 worth of assets still need to be settled. It's pretty interesting. And I knew the family ended up in Texas because I had them on the 1880 census in Texas. But I had no idea when they got there. We have 10 years in between census records, and we don't know when people moved. She's in Chambers County in 1870. 1880, she's in Texas. So now I know that she's moved to Texas, probably 1874. I'm sure that the plantation, without the slave labor, they couldn't keep running the plantation. And a lot of people went to Texas to start over, basically. And I'm sure that she took the younger children and some of the older sons and took off. So then it's kind of fun because everything goes blank for 7 more years. We don't hear anything about the family in Alabama. But then there's a paper, and it's talking about how Cynthia was removed as executrix. And there's a man named N.D. Denson, and he wants to be the administrator de bonus non. And he says that Cynthia Royston departed this life in the state of Texas on or about the 2nd day of August, 1882. Can you believe that? So I got the death date of Thomas B. Royston and of Cynthia, which is amazing. I had looked for her death record. There's nothing about her death out in Texas because it was the frontier at the time. But here, back in Alabama, in this probate record is buried her death date.
What a great find. You just never know what you're going to find in these probate records. Holy cow. And why didn't you find this probate record, the first time that you were searching for his will? What is your tip for people who are kind of beginners with the probate and wills? How do you find all the rest of the file if you just have the will?
It's just education. I didn't even know there was a file. I think if I had known, I could have written to the court and I could have said, can you send me the entire estate file? Because I'm sure it was right there in the county courthouse. And he could have photocopied the rest of the estate file, but I had no idea. I didn't even know to ask for it. So anybody listening, now you know, and you won't repeat my mistakes. There's probably an estate file. Sometimes there isn't. Sometimes there is just the will, especially if there's a lot of property. And there was a lot of property and a lot of possessions involved here. So if someone has had a lot of stuff, be looking for extra stuff. And how would you find that? We really talked a lot about that in the last episode, but you can find that on Family Search. I'd go to the specific county or to Ancestry and look for more information besides just the wills. So it's kind of fun to finish up this case study of Thomas B. Royston. This N.D. Denson, the children of Thomas B. Royston were not really fans of him taking over to settle the rest of this land, but he gets granted the administration duties. But 4 of the children out in Texas file a protest against him being granted administrator. And why would he want to do it? Probably because he was getting paid. He was probably trying to pick up some work wherever he could. But because some of these were daughters and they came in with their husbands, they had to take the 2 girls apart and separately interview them to make sure they weren't being coerced by their husbands into this action. So I have all this paperwork coming from Texas being sent back to Alabama saying, no, we don't want him to be the administrator, stop this. But it was too late. By the time that came, the remaining heirs in Alabama had already been summoned to court, and it was just too late to contest it for the final sale. And then we have at the very end, in 1883, a final settlement by this N.D. Denson, and he appears before the judge and swears he's not used any of the funds of the estate for his own benefit. And he swears on oath and names for the last time the heirs, their ages, and their residences. And he names all of those heirs out in Texas, which was key for me connecting my Robert C. Royston in Texas to Thomas B. Royston in Alabama, because I had the Texas-Alabama connection, which I needed. That was really, really key in connecting. It was all in direct evidence of putting this together. The will did directly state son Robert C. Royston, but we can often have men of the same name. And so we need to put that with other things that say, okay, this is identifying the same man. So there you have it. There's my story of the Thomas B. Royston estate, which turned out to be pretty dramatic. And as I was transcribing that, I could hardly stop because I wanted to see what was going to happen next.
That's how I get too with these big files, because you just never know what clue is hiding in image 40 out of 70.
Yeah, it's so fun. So tell us about, I know you've just done a really fun project.
Yes, I did. I had a big client project that I worked on. It was really big because it was about a man with a common name, John Johnson. And so I had to go through a lot of different John Johnsons in Rowan County, North Carolina, and try to identify this man's ancestor that I was researching about. So my objective was to identify John Johnson, whose will was recorded on February 5th, 1808, in Will Book G of Rowan County, North Carolina, on page 101 to 102, in which his son, Harris Johnson, is listed, as well as his father, Abraham Johnson, is listed. So this was a really unique will because at the very end of the will, John lists all of his children, his wife, but at the very end, after he signs it, he puts a little addendum at the bottom of the will. And he says that he wants to give the legacy left to him by his father, Abraham Johnson, to some of his sons, but not all of them, just 7 out of 9 of his sons. So I thought that was really interesting that this will not only lists his wife and his heirs, but it even lists his father's name. So it was a huge clue. And my client wanted to connect John Johnson of Rowan County back to a man by the name of Abraham Johnson. We just didn't know which one. There were a few. There were several different ones. So I started with identifying John and then going from there to try to link him back to his father. So starting with this will, I just had to use only the clues within this will. That's really all I had to start with.
So I just wanted to talk to you just a minute about your objective, because usually in our objectives we'll say things like, they were born here, married here, died here, but you didn't have any of that, did you?
I just had only his will, which stated when he wrote the will and then when it was recorded.
But you did have a time and place. You had Rowan County and you had the date, so that helps to identify specifically this John Johnson. Mm-hmm. So what did you do first? What was your first step?
Well, I wanted to locate the original image of the will because the client had just given me a transcription from a book that his father had put together. So I wanted to just kind of find the original image, make sure that everything on it was the same as the transcription. And in the process of doing that, I located it on Family Search by going to the Family Search catalog, going to Rowan County, and then going to the probate records created by Rowan County. They were digitized, so I could just browse to that will book and then to that page number, and it was right there. But then I also was looking on Ancestry, and I saw that the will of John Johnson from Rowan County was also on Ancestry. And when I looked at that image, it was different from the image that was in the county will book. And it was actually the loose papers of the will. And as I looked at it, it looked like the original writing of John Johnson. So it had his signature. It was kind of a little messier, but it was neat to see his handwriting and his signature. And it also had one difference from the will that was recorded in the will book versus this loose will. And that was just the size of his land. In the copied version, it said 217.5 acres, which I thought, well, what does that mean? And then in the actual original will that John wrote himself, it said 275. So it was pretty obvious that that was probably what it meant, 217.5. But the guy writing it just wrote 17 because he wasn't paying attention.
Let me just make a comment here that that's a really good example of original versus derivative. Sometimes we think that those will books that we get the information of are original, but as you can see, there was a will that was copied into that. So even when we're looking at something that was created in 1808, some errors could creep in. And so that's just always something good to keep in mind. We go as original as we can because sometimes we don't have loose papers seeing the original will in the handwriting, but it's just always good to understand how these records were created.
Right, and that they were often copied. All right, so what I did next was I went through all the clues in the will and then used those clues to go forward and find more records. So one of the things that I was able to do was to find land records because the will actually stated that the road that he lived on was Mora's Road. So I was able to use that and find out where that road was. The road doesn't really exist anymore, or actually it does. It's just called a highway or an interstate now, but I found an old map that showed where the road was. And then some other clues from that, like the size of the land, 275 acres, and some other land records that I found where he was listed with one of his sons named Randall. And Randall Johnson is a much more unique name than John Johnson. So when I found some land records where the witness was Randall, I knew this was the correct John. And so then I found that the land was on a certain creek. It was on Cabin Creek and it was 275 acres. It was near the road that was listed in the will. Then I had some more clues that could lead me to other records. Another clue from the will was that two of the older sons were not executors and were not given very much of the inheritance because I hypothesized that they had already received their inheritance and they had left the county, so they weren't the executors. Have you found that to be common, that sometimes older children will have already left and received their inheritance?
Yeah, I have. And that can be kind of tricky. I mean, we obviously wish that every single child is named in the will, but I'm working on a case right now, and the will only mentions the wife. And I know from other records that there were a bunch of other children, and they're right there in the county.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, unfortunately, sometimes that does happen. So, what we have to do is keep a really open mind and maybe have more than just one hypothesis about what might have happened. We might want to do a little brainstorming and make a list of all the possibilities that could have happened, because we tend to get in this little tunnel frame of mind, like this is what had to have happened. He didn't have any other children because they're not named in the will, when in reality, of course, he had more. So I think it's really good to keep an open mind and think about all the different possibilities.
Right. Yeah. This man had named these older sons just one time, but he hadn't given them very much of his estate. So it was interesting. And the other interesting clue that I found in this will was that one of the sons wasn't 16 yet. So I knew that his children were younger and that they were still minors. And another thing that I did was to make a list of friends, associates, and neighbors for this project because John Johnson was such a common name. So I started with the two witnesses of the will and I put them on the list of fans, friends, associates, and neighbors. And they were the start of my list of fans that actually became really long. I had a long list of fans of John Johnson that helped me identify him. After I found the will that was recorded in the will book, I realized that there was going to probably be an additional estate file with the division of the estate and all the papers and the inventory of the sale and those kind of things. So I didn't find it right away because the county split right after he died, about 10 years after. And the estate division papers were in the other county. So Rowan County split into two, and there was another county called Davidson County created in 1822. So when I was looking there in their probate records, I found the estate papers for John Johnson in 1825. So this is about 17 years after he died.
Oh, wow.
It took a while. And you know why? It was because William, the youngest son of John, wasn't 16 until 1821. And so that's when they started the process. And that was what I found out. I found out a lot of really great clues in the probate file. The will was helpful, but the probate file was amazing because the probate listed all kinds of friends and neighbors who bought his stuff. So I added them to my fan list. And then it also listed some of the children's residences, one of the daughter's husbands, and it listed that William became of age in 1821, so I could figure out that his birth year was 1805. So I found a lot of great clues in it. At first, I looked at the file and thought, oh, this doesn't really have anything new. But when I transcribed every single page, I noticed so many clues. And as I was writing the report, I went back and created citations for so many of those images in the probate file because I needed to use them as evidence.
Isn't that awesome? It is amazing. You just don't realize all those little things. And I love that you made your big long list of associates from the probate. That's so helpful, especially when it's a man named John Johnson. So I know a lot of listeners are at brick walls. This is an excellent strategy to do that, to go back and make a list of all the associates that your ancestor dealt with, because often those are the people that they move to a new state with, and they're going to be the clue to getting them to the home state. And I based an entire project. It was on a John Cooper, I believe, and his will was signed by a Robert Grinder. And Robert Grinder was found only in one county in North Carolina. So I was able to track this John Cooper, which was an incredibly common name, kind of like your Johnson, and all from that associate.
So one of the other interesting things that I found in the probate file of John Johnson was his daughter's husband. So Mary, John's daughter, and her husband petitioned for their share of the estate. So there were a bunch of papers about that. And so I was able to find the marriage of them in Rowan County in about 1800. And another interesting thing that I found, which is kind of a side note, is that on the finder grave for Benjamin Davis, the memorial there, it said that he was the brother to Jefferson Davis. So that would be the president of the CSA. So I didn't do any research to verify that, but I thought it was an interesting find. Another clue that was fun was that the youngest son, William, when I found out his birth date was about 1805, I was then able to locate him on the 1850 census, living in Davidson County, which had split off from Rowan County, in that same area of land where John Johnson mentioned in his will on that road, Morris Road. And they were just living there still in 1850. And here's a good one. One of the clues on a different paper, which was a notice to the sheriff of Burke County, North Carolina, was to summon Abraham Johnson, the executor of John Johnson, for business regarding the estate. So when I got that county, Burke County, I thought, oh, perfect. Now I can go research for Abraham Johnson in Burke County and trace him forward, because I hadn't been able to trace very many of the children forward with such common names, and not many of them had stayed in Rowan County or in Davidson County. So when I found out that Abraham had moved to Burke County, I searched in that county and found him in the 1820 census. And then I was able to trace him forward to another nearby county and even find his War of 1812 pension application. And when I found that, I was able to find his wife's maiden name and when he married her. And she was named Jane Kinney. And Kinney was the surname of one of the fans in my list for John Johnson. So I knew that it was the right person. So all of these clues were just coming together to help me put the family together, all just based on the probate file. So it was a really amazing probate file. And one fun note about Abraham Johnson, he lived to be 105 years old, and he was listed on the 1880 census, which was great because then I could see what he put for his parents' birthplaces. And I needed to know where John Johnson was born because I only had his will. But because I had this 1880 census, I found out that he was possibly born in North Carolina, which is what his son Abraham reported, or whoever the informant was on that census. So, wow, there were so many good discoveries that came from just this probate record.
Oh, and isn't that so fun that he lived to be 105?
Yeah, I couldn't believe it.
I was doing a project, and it was Virginia, I believe. No, it was Maryland in the 1700s. And I had hypothesized that there was an extra generation in between these two men. And then I started really doing the math, and I figured out that there wasn't, that the one guy lived to be 80. And he named his son in the will. There was nobody in between. But sometimes I think we just assume that everybody died young back in the day, and apparently they didn't. So again, we have to have an open mind. There are usual things, but there's the unusual also, and often our family history is full of the unusual.
That is so true. And, I forgot to mention one of the most important things from that project. I was trying to find the next generation back, Abraham Johnson, the father of John. And one of the clues that I got from the probate file that helped with this was that list of fans, those friends and associates. And it was about a list of 10 people. And a couple of the names were uncommon, like Newsom, that surname. And when I found a candidate that I thought was a match for Abraham Johnson in Halifax County, North Carolina, I found that same surname, Newsom, as a neighbor and an associate of Abraham Johnson. So that was a clue that kind of gave me some evidence to tie the families together. So I haven't been able to prove it conclusively yet, but it was something that helped with the hypothesis. So it was good.
Oh, yeah. And that's a good piece of indirect evidence that you can use in proving your case. So it sounds like you did a great job on that project and that you came up with some really good stuff. And I'm pretty sure this was probably a brick wall for this client, right? I'm sure a lot of people had worked on it and just were completely stymied. So the probate file, just doing all the work that you did on that really opened up the case, didn't it?
It did. Yes, it was fun. All right, well, let's do our last little case study now of the probate of Georgia A. Dawson. So let's just talk about why you were researching her.
This is one of those examples of, when we'd go up to the library, at the family history library, and we'd make photocopies of all of the surnames in the books. And we worked on the Roystons a lot. And so I had taken neighboring counties of Chambers County where they lived, and I had done a scan of all the books. And I had found this will abstract that named a Georgia Dawson, and in her will abstract, she named two nieces, Sarah and Mary Royston. Well, this is the time frame where my Roystons were living in the next county over, and my Cynthia Dillard Royston also had two girls named Sarah and Mary. And I'm trying so hard to figure out who Cynthia Dillard Royston's father is, which Dillard man is her father. And I saw this and I thought, oh, maybe this Georgia Dawson is related to Cynthia. Could she be a sister? I knew that nieces maybe didn't necessarily mean specifically nieces, but I just had this feeling there might be a connection because of the names, the locality, and everything. But the funny thing was I had photocopied that paper and just put it in my files and forgot all about it. And then I was looking through my files and wanting to do another project on trying to discover Cynthia's father, and I came across that paper. So I decided for one of my study group projects, this would be my case, to just figure out who Georgia Dawson is. So that was kind of like your objective, where all you had was the will, and you wanted to identify this person and figure out who they were. And that's exactly what it was with Georgia. I just wanted to identify Georgia and see if there was a connection to Cynthia Dillard Royston.
So what was your objective then?
Well, I worded it like this. The objective of this research project is to identify Georgia Ann Lewis Dawson, died in 1956, Russell County, Alabama. Georgia married John W. Dawson, 6 February 1850 in Russell County. So I didn't have a lot to go on. I obviously didn't have that marriage record at first, but I did a really quick search just to see if I could find something about her marriage and found that. So I added that as a little bit more identifying information about her.
So what did you do after writing your objective?
Well, I had to also go to the original. I just had an abstract of a will, which was even less helpful. The funny thing was the abstract had the date of the will as 1856, which is what I put in the objective. But looking at the original, when I found it, it was actually 1861. So that was off by 5 years, which makes a difference in your research plan. So first thing I did was I found her actual will, and I looked at that marriage record and I did some analysis on that. I did my locality guide on Russell County, and then I did a research plan. It was actually really a fun project because I had not researched her before. So I could go to the censuses. I could do all the sort of easier type research. So I did censuses, I did marriage records. I don't think I even needed to do the land records, but that was in my research plan. So my first thing was to actually transcribe the will and all the probate documents to see if I could figure out family connections and the witnesses.
Yeah, that is so important to transcribe everything. We've been saying that over and over, and you just really have to transcribe every document, and then the clues start to stand out as you go through it all. So was there anything interesting that stood out to you?
Well, her will, when I actually got into the real will and transcribed the whole thing, rather than just picking out the names, That's when I found the interesting thing about her burial. And I pulled up my documents, so I'll read the exact wording here. She says, when they've paid all of her debts, she wants her trustee, O.L. Lewis, who is her brother, she wants him to place over the graves of my mother, stepmother, and myself 3 marble slabs, first removing the remains of my stepmother and my 2 children from their present burial place, to where my own mother is buried, and in one grave place myself and 2 children with a marble slab over us. And then in parentheses it says, if there should not be money enough to do this, and the proceeds arising from the sale of what furniture I have must go to help defray the expenses of the same. So for me, that was pretty significant. But here's another thing. The abstract did not clearly explain some of the things. It missed one of the sisters, and it talked about those 2 girls, Sarah and Mary Royston, but it gives more information. It says, the 4th part between my 2 nieces, Sarah and Mary Royston, my eldest sister's 2 daughters by her first husband. That right there, when I read that, I thought, oh, this probably is not Cynthia, because she was only married once. This is probably a whole different family. But I needed to continue researching, so I went through that entire case file. And keep in mind, I don't know who George's father is. And so I did the same thing you did. I took out the friends, associates, and neighbors. And when I came to her inventory, I saw that her estate sale was being done at the estate, or at the home of Noland Lewis. And I had figured out her maiden name was Lewis. And then there were all these different men with the name of Lewis who were buying her things. So one thing to know about Georgia is she is leaving her entire estate to her daughter Lily. And so who would be buying all of her estate? Probably her family members. If Lily's the little girl, they want to have her to get as much money as possible. So there were a lot of clues in just the inventory and the estate sale that gave me some ideas of other associates and family members.
So you mentioned some different types of documents that were found in the probate. So let's just review what kind of documents we might find within a probate file, because there's all kinds of different things. Sometimes they don't have a title on them, but what were the ones that you saw?
We had the will, first of all, and then right after that was the probate filing, when the executor went in and actually filed it. And that helped to narrow down when she died, because she wrote her will on February 20th of 1861, and the probate was filed 20 April 1861. So it's really likely that she died the first part of April. And so that was helpful to have the date of comparing the will to the filing statement. And then there's a witness statement. The witnesses generally have to go in and say, yes, I was there, I witnessed her will. Then they do the inventory and appraisement of her property. So there's a whole listing of everything there that she owns, literally everything, to 1 pair of candlesticks for $1, to a mattress and pillows. I mean, you really see the whole household, which is fascinating. And then after that, there's a witness statement saying that the appraisal and the inventory was true. And then you have a witness statement saying that it's necessary to have a sale. And then you get the sale receipt, and then you get a final settlement in 1864. And I have not researched this family anymore, because I completed my objective, found that she was not related to Cynthia Dillard. So I did not see what happened to her daughter or figure out what happened years down the road from this. But so many interesting things in that particular estate file. And everyone will have similar things and may have some different things, just depending on the situation.
Great. Wow. Well, we're almost out of time for this episode, but can you just tell us, what research did you do that you got ideas for from the probate file?
Well, I had the names of her sisters. And so one of my things on my research plan was to try to find her parents, because I hypothesized that perhaps they were still living in the area and that maybe the sisters were in the household. And so I did that. I found the 1850 census, which had this Nolan R. Lewis in it. And guess what? In the household were the names of the sisters that she mentions in the will. And so then I was able to go look for marriage records. And I wanted to find that older sister who had the 2 nieces. And I did find an older sister, a Mildred Lewis. And when I looked for her on Family Search, I found her obituary. And the cool thing was, her obituary not only names her parents, who were this Nolan Lewis, it also names his parents and her mother's parents.
Wow.
So following down the sister and then researching her, I was able to really put together this family. And it all just came from the will, the clues from the relationships, and trying to figure out what other records I could research.
Well, that's wonderful. Thanks for sharing it with us. All right, well, that's the end of the case studies. Let's review the different types of probate documents that you might find. There's the petition to administer, which happens right after the decease of an individual. The executor files a petition to begin administering the estate. Then we mentioned a bunch of different times the inventory or appraisal of the estate, where appraisers go in and look at all the items in the land and tell how much it's worth. And then there's the sale of the personal and real estate. So you might see a list of sales or different receipts from the sale in the file. Then you'll also probably see some debts paid to creditors by the executor and maybe some papers about the widow's rights and the guardians appointed for minors and the final settlement. So wow, there's so many things you could find in a probate file. So we hope that you guys can go forward now and have more success with finding out these wills and probate files for your ancestors and learning from them more about your ancestors' life and their relatives.
Right. And just as a final piece of advice, don't be intimidated by it. Just give it a try, see what you can find out, because I guarantee it will be worth it in the end. So good luck, everybody, on your probate research.
All right. And don't forget to pick up our freebie and download that. The link is in the show notes, but it's a probate records cheat sheet to help you with everything we've talked about today. All right. We'll talk to you guys next week. Hope you have a great holiday season, and we will talk to you again soon.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you for listening to Research Like a Pro with Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional, and Nicole Dyer. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your own genealogy research. If you like what you heard, please leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher, or visit our website, familylocket.com, to contact us. You can find our book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist's Guide, on Amazon.com and other booksellers. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.